Anybody who has ever read the New Testament with a critical eye will notice right off the bat that the genealogy, or family tree, of Jesus is different depending on which gospel you read. And the reason for that is actually quite fascinating. First off, the physical human birth of Jesus is only mentioned in 2 of our 4 gospels, Matthew and Luke. Mark has no birth narrative at all and starts his gospel when Jesus was roughly 30 years old. John's gospel begins with Jesus as a pre-existent entity known in Greek as the Logos. So we only have 2 gospels that tell us anything about the birth of Jesus. And interestingly enough, Matthew and Luke both include genealogies as part of their birth narratives. But what's even more fascinating is that if you line them up side by side and take a look at them, it won't take you long to realize that the names are different and the number of names are different as well. Matthew's genealogy gives us a list of 40 names in Jesus' family tree, and those 40 names aren't including the 5 women names that are mentioned, and we'll talk about that more in just a little bit. Luke's gospel gives us 76 names. So what's going on here, and what can we learn by analyzing these 2 genealogies? Well, as it turns out, we can actually learn quite a bit. Let's start with Matthew. Matthew's genealogy is broken down into 3 categories of the descendants of Jesus, from Abraham to King David, from King David to the deportation to Babylon, and from the deportation to Babylon to the birth of Jesus. Now, why would Matthew choose to break his genealogy down into these 3 distinct chunks or groupings? Now, obviously, these groups represent major events and people in Jewish history, but I think what's going on is far more nuanced than that. These 3 chunks are not random. Matthew knows exactly what he's doing. Now, Matthew actually draws even more attention to this strange grouping right after his genealogy by saying this in Matthew 1:17. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. 14, 14, 14. Now, this set of numbers might seem completely random and insignificant to us today, but the ancient Hebrew people would have known exactly what Matthew was doing. Matthew was giving us an additional message by this unique grouping. Now, this message can actually be decoded by using Hebrew gematria. Gematria might sound complicated, but it basically just means that you can create letters, words, and even sentences by using numbers instead of letters. An English example of this would be like if A equals 1 and B equals 2 and so on. And if I wanted to spell the word cat, I could do C equals 3, A equals 1, T equals 20. Then I could add up all the numbers and get the word cat in English gematria, which is 24. Now, in English, we don't do this very often, but in ancient Hebrew, they did this all the time. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the significance of the numerical value 14, 14, 14? Here is a picture of the Hebrew alphabet with the corresponding numerical values for gematria. There are a few things that can equal 14, but really only one with any significance here. Take a look at how you spell David's name in Hebrew. Dalet, Vav, Dalet. Now let's go back to the numerical values. Dalet, we see, has the value of 4. Vav has the value of 6, and Dalet again the value of 4. So 4 plus 6 plus 4 equals 14. 14 is David in Hebrew gematria. So why would any of this matter? Well, it's because the issue of pedigree was extremely important to ancient Jews, because the Messiah, as predicted in the Old Testament, had to be from the line of David. King David, the second of Israel's kings, was seen as the ideal king. He wasn't perfect, of course, but he was a man after God's own heart, as well as a man of military might. The Jewish understanding of the Messiah was that one would come from the lineage of David as a great and powerful king. They would destroy the occupying enemies of the Jews and establish a kingdom of peace and true worship among the people. What Matthew is doing here is he is telling us that Jesus is from the lineage of King David, and he has the right pedigree to be the true Messiah. Matthew is saying that everything about Jesus points back to King David because he is the long-awaited Messiah. So Matthew is not just giving us a historical genealogy, but he's giving us a theological genealogy of Jesus as well. There is one problem with Matthew's genealogy, however, and that is that it proves that Jesus is the adopted son of Joseph because the Gospels are clear. Jesus is not the son of Mary and Joseph, but only the son of Mary. So Jesus doesn't really have a biological claim to the throne, but only a legal or adopted claim to the throne. So does Jesus have a biological lineage to the throne of Israel? Well, Luke's gospel is actually going to help us out with this, but we're going to look at a few more interesting things in Matthew before moving on to Luke. All Jewish genealogies trace the lineage of someone through the father. Very rarely do you ever find women in a genealogy. But in Matthew's gospel, you find 5. And these women are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Uriah's wife, aka Bathsheba, and Mary, the mother of Jesus. What's perhaps even more interesting about 4 out of the 5 women in this list is that they all have something kind of scandalous in common. 1, they are foreigners, and 2, they all have a history of sexual promiscuity. The first, Tamar, was the daughter-in-law of Judah. You can read the entire story in Genesis chapter 38, but essentially what happens is Tamar dresses up like a prostitute and entices Judah, her father-in-law, to have sexual relations with her. The union between these two produced twin boys, Perez and Zara. Next, Rahab was a tavern keeper or prostitute in the book of Joshua. Then Ruth, being a Moabite woman, was bad enough already because Israelites were forbidden from marrying Moabites because of their reputation for being sexually tempting. And Ruth herself crawled into Boaz's bed after he was drunk one night and tried to get him to marry her. Then lastly, the famous Bathsheba. Although Matthew doesn't even name her because the disgrace is so bad. Matthew just calls her Uriah's wife. The story, of course, is the famous account of King David seeing Bathsheba, taking a bath, and him having sexual relations with her, even though she was married. And then to make matters worse, David then has Uriah killed by sending him to the front line of battle. Okay, so why would Matthew mention these 4 sexually promiscuous women in his genealogy when most genealogies only mention men anyway? Could Matthew be hinting that the last woman in his genealogy also had a strange, perhaps even sexually promiscuous encounter? And that next woman, of course, would be Mary, the mother of Jesus. Mary, as the story goes, conceived Jesus through the overshadowing of the Holy Spirit. What exactly that means is anyone's guess. But it's not saying that God himself actually physically had sex with Mary. That would be more in line with Greek mythology. Matthew clearly isn't saying that, but he also doesn't get into the details of how Mary was conceived, just the mysterious work of God. In many Christian circles, suggesting that Mary was sexually promiscuous and maybe had sex outside of marriage is high-level blasphemy. But despite that, there are some very credible Bible scholars that believe Mary must have been sexually promiscuous, because why else would Matthew mention it this way? Could Mary have gotten pregnant out of wedlock with another man? A human other than Joseph? These 4 other women mentioned in Matthew's genealogy are often used in Jewish circles as proof that amazing things can come from a questionable past. These women are often looked at as being almost heroic in a lot of ways, even despite their shortcomings. I mean, if these other 4 women who were sexually promiscuous could be part of King David's lineage, couldn't the Messiah have a lineage that goes back to someone who was also sexually promiscuous? I'm not saying that that is exactly what's going on, but I do think it's interesting and good food for thought. Now, reading Matthew in the original Greek gives us more food for thought because of how he words it. The literal translation of Matthew from the Greek reads like this: "From Mary was fathered Jesus called the Christ." Mary fathered Jesus. Now that is a strange pairing of words, and yet this is how the Greek phrases it, indicating that Matthew knows genealogies are supposed to be the lineage of the father, not the mother. So Matthew covers himself by saying his mother fathered him. Now, one last interesting thing about Matthew's genealogy is that it shows that Joseph was related to Jeconiah, Israel's last king that was related to King David. So why would this be significant? Because in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 22, verse 30, God says this about Jeconiah. Thus says the Lord, record this man as childless, a man who shall not succeed in his days, for none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judea. That's a bummer because Jesus, through Joseph adopting him, is in the lineage of this cursed Jeconiah. So we have a huge conundrum on our hands. Can Jesus actually rightfully be the Messiah? Just based on Matthew's genealogy alone, Jesus can't be the Messiah. He doesn't have the right pedigree, and he's related to the cursed Jeconiah, who can never sit on God's throne in Israel. Jesus would need not just an adopted lineage to King David, but he would need a biological lineage to King David to truly be the Messiah, and preferably a lineage that is not related to the cursed Jeconiah. So what do we do about this? Does Jesus actually have a true biological connection to King David and one that isn't cursed? With this, in comes Luke's genealogy. At first glance, Luke's genealogy is entirely different from Matthew's. There's a different amount of names, there's different names themselves, there's no women mentioned, there's no three groupings of 14, 14, 14. So Luke is clearly taking a very different approach here. Again, at first glance, it appears as if Luke or Matthew have conflicting information, because Matthew says Joseph's father's name was Jacob, and Luke seems to suggest that Joseph's father's name was Heli. So which one is right? Was Joseph's father's name Jacob, as Matthew suggests, or Heli, as Luke suggests? Most scholars would agree that the hang-up here comes by how genealogies were supposed to be written. Genealogies were supposed to only mention the men and be from the male side of every line, so from the father. Luke actually draws attention to the strange circumstances around this genealogy by saying Jesus was the son, as was supposed, of Joseph. Luke is making it clear that Joseph wasn't really his father, but only by adoption. Then Luke mentions Joseph's father as Heli. What most scholars suspect is going on is that Luke is actually giving us the lineage of Jesus' mother. But Luke tries very hard to keep only men in his genealogy, so he can't mention Mary just outright. Now, this isn't just a guess by scholars. There are actually two very good reasons why we think Luke preserves Mary's family tree. The first reason is because Jews kept very, very good records, especially of family trees. If Luke or Matthew were just making up lineages out of nowhere, it would be extremely easy for someone to come along and invalidate them. So it seems very unlikely that Matthew or Luke was just creating this family tree out of thin air. The second reason scholars think that Luke is preserving Mary's lineage is because we actually have some ancient church traditions that tell us bits and pieces of Mary's lineage. There is a text called the Proto-Evangelium of James, or sometimes also called the Infancy Gospel of James, that gives us Mary's mother and father's name. According to this text, Mary's mother's name is Anna, and her father's name is Joachim. Now, you may be thinking this doesn't help us at all because Joachim and Heli are still not the same name. As a matter of fact, they sound very, very different. But it may help you if you know that Eliakim is a form of the traditional name Joachim, and Heli is a nickname for Eliakim. So knowing this, it actually seems likely that Luke is preserving the real genealogy of Mary, not Joseph. And interestingly enough, Mary is also related to King David, but not related to the cursed Jeconiah through Solomon, but related to King David through one of his other sons that he had with Bathsheba, named Nathan. Thus, Jesus did in fact have a biological lineage to King David. Lastly, Luke's genealogy not only gives us great insight into Jesus' royal lineage, but also into his priestly lineage. Luke's genealogy gives us 6 names that are associated with the priestly lineage. Look and see for yourself. There are 2 Mathats, 2 Matthiases, and 2 Levis. The name Levi or Matthew has very priestly undertones, considering all priests were to come from the lineage of Aaron from the tribe of Levi. Levitical priests, as they were called, by definition, had to come from the tribe of Levi. So it's quite possible that Mary's lineage was not just royal in nature, but had a lot of ties to the priesthood as well. Jesus was, in fact, the perfect candidate for being the Messiah, because we know from Luke's genealogy, by tracing Mary, that Jesus had not only royal blood, but he also had priestly blood. So we had the perfect pedigree for being the Messiah. The Messiah in late Second Temple Judaism was thought as being a priest and a king, fused together. And so people genuinely thought Jesus was the perfect Messiah and that he had everything needed to assume the throne. It's time now for a bonus fact. Did you know that the word Nazareth comes from the Hebrew word netzer, which means branch or shoot? Nazareth can loosely be translated as branch town, which is kind of a strange name for such a small and insignificant place. But it makes sense if you know that in Isaiah chapter 11, the Messiah of David's lineage is called a branch. This is a term that stuck. Even when reading the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were written before Jesus was even born, we find that the future Messiah is described as the branch of David. So why is any of this significant? Well, because Nazareth likely got its name because the people who lived there were from the lineage of King David. So it's not surprising to find Mary and Joseph coming from Nazareth in Galilee because it's branch town. It's where you would expect the Messiah to come from because all of the people there have the right pedigree. Stay thirsty for knowledge.